What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most powerful studio bosses once called in the mob to threaten the life of a beloved black entertainer, not over money, not over crime, but over love? And what if I added this? That man wasn't disgraced, wasn't exposed in his lifetime, and instead received one of the grandest funerals in Hollywood history, attended by 2,000 people, many of whom came just to make sure he was really dead. Now, pause and think about that for a moment. In the post-Weinstein era, we've seen predators fall like dominoes. We've watched careers evaporate overnight under the weight of long-ignored abuse. But back then, the tyrants ran the show, sometimes quite literally, and no one ran it harder, darker, or more ruthlessly than Harry Cohn, the king of Columbia Pictures, and perhaps the most feared man ever to walk a studio lot. Welcome to the channel. If this is your first time here, we dig into the untold stories behind Hollywood's golden age. Not the glitter, but the shadow it casts. Make sure you subscribe and hit that bell icon, because what you'll find Harry no studio ever wanted you to know. Today's story isn't about a movie. It's about power, how it's built, how it's abused, and how it can twist something as beautiful as art and as fragile as human dignity into a weapon. This is the story of Harry Cohn, a name that once made actors shudder, directors curse, and starlets whisper warnings in dressing rooms wired for surveillance. And it begins not in Beverly Hills or on the set of some grand production, but in the slums of Manhattan's Lower East Side, where a boy named Harry Cohn first learned that in America, you could take anything if you were bold enough to grab it. He quit school at 14, hustled everything from furs to pool tables. He had a voice, a temper, and a thick skin. That's all he needed to talk his way into the early film industry, where he and his brother started what was basically a joke of a Studio CBC, which insiders mocked as standing for corned beef and cabbage. But Cohn didn't care. He built Columbia Pictures the same way someone might build a racket, with grit, intimidation, and a sense of showmanship borrowed from vaudeville and organized crime alike. He once said, "I built Columbia with spit and wire and these fists." And he wasn't exaggerating. For all his crudeness, Cohn had an uncanny sense for what America wanted to watch. He hired Frank Capra accident. Some sand together. They created It Happened One Night, the first film to win all 5 major Oscars. That movie didn't just make Columbia a serious player, it made it elite. And it made Cohn dangerous, because now he had legitimacy. And when a man like Harry Cohn gets legitimacy, he stops pretending to be a partner. He becomes a dictator. By the 1930s, he was both president of Columbia and head of product Iona, concentration of power no other studio boss had. His office was modeled after Mussolini's, complete with a raised platform to make visitors look up at him. Behind his chair, a glass case of Oscars, trophies not just of success, but of submission. He bullied directors, sabotaged careers, controlled every contract. He wasn't just the boss, she was the judge, the jury, and when needed, the executioner. But it didn't stop at the office door. For actresses, especially those just starting out, Cohn wasn't just a producer, he was a gatekeeper to the very idea of fame. The casting couch wasn't a metaphor at Columbia. It was policy. And here's the part that still leaves a bitter taste. When people talk about Cohn today, they mention the films, the awards, the way he saw potential in people like Rita Hayworth and Kim Novak. But what they rarely say out loud is what it cost those women to be seen. There's a reason Jean Arthur, the same woman who starred in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, once carried a loaded gun on the Columbia lot with the intention of shooting Harry Cohn in the hallway. A reason she ultimately chose to walk away from Hollywood rather than spend one more day under his rule. This isn't a story about one bad man. It's a story about a system that allowed bad men to thrive. A system where genius could excuse anything. where a box office success could silence every whisper, where love real. Personal love could be treated like a PR problem if it didn't fit the image a studio wanted to sell. And the tragedy? It worked. Because despite everything, despite every woman humiliated, every director silenced, every moral line crossed, Columbia Pictures under Harry Cohn flourished. It won Oscars. It made classics. It created stars. And when Cohn finally died in 1958 of a massive heart attack, they turned one of Columbia's sound stages into a funeral hall. People came in droves, some in tears, others in relief. Comedian Red Skelton summed it up best. Give the people what they want, and they'll show up, even if it's just to watch your coffin close. So, before we dive into the tangled details of the Novak Davis scandal, before we unpack how a studio boss weaponized the mob to enforce racial purity on the silver screen, ask yourself this. Is it possible for someone to make great art and still be, in every other way, a monster? And more disturbingly, have we really changed? Stick around. The deeper we go, the darker it gets. Power rarely announces itself all at once. It builds layer by layer, deal by deal, silence by silence. And Harry Cohn knew exactly how to construct an empire that answered to no one but himself. After it happened one night, shattered expectations, and collected a clean sweep at the Oscars in 1935, Columbia Pictures, once dismissed as a second-rate joke, was now standing shoulder to shoulder with the biggest names in the industry. But while the film elevated the studio's reputation, it did something far more dangerous behind closed doors. It confirmed to Harry Cohn that fear and instinct were enough, that he didn't need allies. He needed control. He wasted no time making that clear. Within a year, Cohn pushed his own brother Jack out of the executive spotlight. Columbia wasn't big enough for two Cohns, and Harry had no intention of sharing the throne. From that point forward, he held both the business and creative reins of the studio, becoming the sole captain of the ship and the storm that followed it. And what a storm it was. Behind the prestige posters and marquee lights was a company built like a fortress. Cohn's office resembled something between a courtroom and a battlefield. He had a massive desk installed atop a raised platform deliberately higher than any guest chair. A visitor's first view wasn't of the man, but of the Oscar statues glowing behind him, like golden bodyguards silently declaring who held the power. People didn't just visit Harry Cohn, they entered an arena where they were meant to be humbled. Former employees described being kept waiting for hours, listening to the buzz of that inner office intercom that decided their fate. And when you were finally let in, Cohn greeted you not with pleasantries, but with a glare sharpened by decades of street survival. He spoke in insults, barked orders, and seemed to revel in the fear his presence inspired. This wasn't eccentricity. It was calculated dominance. And yet, through this regime of tension and testosterone, Columbia Pictures thrived. He wasn't the kind of boss who simply signed off on productions. Cohn micromanaged every frame, from costume fittings to dialogue edits. His signature wasn't just on the payroll, it was embedded in the creative DNA of every picture. In a twisted sense, he believed he was the auteur. To some extent, the results spoke for themselves. Columbia became a hit factory, churning out crowd pleasers like Lost Horizon, The Awful Truth, and Gilda. But what was less visible was the cost of that success. The careers stalled, the personal boundaries obliterated, the systemic rot that no one dared report. Because Harry Cohn didn't just build a studio, he built a kingdom. And in that kingdom, artists were subjects, contracts were chains, and the casting couch wasn't rumor, it was ritual. He once famously said, "If my fanny squirms, the movie's no good." It was meant as a joke, but like all Cohn jokes, it came with an unsettling kernel of truth. His opinion, his alone, was the final test of a film's worth. And woe to the person who challenged that instinct. Frank Capra, the director who had given Cohn his first taste of prestige, quickly found out just how fleeting gratitude could be. As Capra's star began to rise in the late 1930s, Cohn grew increasingly irritated. He didn't like anyone overshadowing the studio, least of all someone he had once plucked from obscurity. So he did what Cohn always reminded Capra who held the leash. When Capra won his second Best Director Oscar for You Can't Take It With You, Columbia ran an ad in the trades promoting a low-budget B-movie, falsely implying that Capra had directed it. It wasn't a mistake, it was a message. And when Capra pushed back, tried to leave Columbia altogether, Cohn blackballed him, quietly, efficiently, and with brutal effectiveness. Capra finished 2 more films under contractual obligation, then walked away forever. This pattern repeated itself with others. Director King Vidor clashed with Cohn over creative autonomy and filed a lawsuit that dragged Columbia's hostile work environment into public court. Cohn, for once, found himself on defense. But even then, the case was buried through backroom negotiation with help from Louis B. Mayer, another studio boss who understood that Hollywood kept its secrets buried beneath box office receipts. In private, Cohn's reputation grew darker still. It wasn't just about business, it was personal. He meddled in the lives of his stars like a puppeteer in a Shakespearean tragedy. He picked their roles, changed their names, rewrote their biographies. Margarita Cancino became Rita Hayworth under his vision. Her hairline burned back through electrolysis, her ethnicity blurred, her curves tailored for the male gaze. All by Cohn's directive. To him, actresses were not collaborators. They were assets, investments, currency. And that philosophy would soon set the stage for a collision of race, gender, and power so volatile it nearly cost a man his life. But we'll get to that. The question for now is this: how did a man known to be this cruel, this controlling, this unapologetically tyrannical hold onto his throne for 3 decades? The answer, it turns out, is chilling in its simplicity, because he got results, because he made people money, because the Oscars kept piling up. In an industry that sells dreams, Harry Cohn learned how to sell nightmares and cash the check. And no one, not directors, not writers, not even the government was strong enough to stop him. At least, not yet. For all his obsession with image, Harry Cohn never cared much for appearances when it came to power. His control wasn't veiled in charm or wrapped in executive polish. It was raw, loud, and deeply personal. And at Columbia Pictures, that control extended far beyond the editing bay or studio lot. It reached into dressing rooms, into bedrooms, into the most intimate corners of the lives he believed he owned. The film industry has always been a place where illusion is currency. But at Columbia, reality was warped into something darker. For many of the women under contract, the line between audition and coercion was almost non-existent. The casting couch wasn't whispered about, it was built into the studio's very architecture. Harry Cohn made sure of that. He operated with the mentality of a monarch, surrounded not by advisors, but by surveillance. Quite literally, Cohn had hidden microphones installed across the Columbia lot, including in the dressing rooms of actresses. He wanted to know who was talking about him, who was seeing outsiders, who might be looking for a way out. If privacy is the bedrock of dignity, then Cohn's Columbia was a dignity-free zone. And still, people stayed. Because the price of speaking out wasn't just your job. It was your future. Cohn's reach went beyond his own studio. He could pick up the phone and make sure a dissenting voice never found work in Hollywood again. That was the true genius of his tyranny. It was invisible to the public, and all-consuming to the people inside. Take, for example, one of Columbia's brightest stars, Jean Arthur, a woman whose smile lit up some of the studio's most enduring films. including Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. What audiences saw was poise, wit, and warmth. What they didn't see was the psychological warfare she endured behind the scenes. For years, Arthur had resisted Cohn's advances. She had pushed back against his controlling tendencies. And in return, she was subjected to what could only be described as an internal siege, constant pressure, subtle sabotage, and an endless barrage of demeaning behavior designed to break her down. But Arthur didn't break. At least, not in the way he expected. By 1945, something in her snapped. The story once whispered among insiders, later confirmed by those close to Harris, almost too cinematic to believe. Arthur, so desperate to escape Cohn's grip, brought a loaded pistol to the Columbia lot. Her plan, she later confessed to a screenwriter, was to kill him. In the hallway, point blank. She believed that if she timed it right, she could do it and disappear into the chaos. But as she roamed the lot, gun concealed, weighing rage against morality, a shift occurred. She didn't pull the trigger. She walked out. Not just from that moment, but from Columbia, from Hollywood, from the career she had fought so hard to build. And maybe that was the cruelest part of all. Not that Cohn could drive someone to consider murder, but that he could make silence feel like the only sane option. Jean Arthur wasn't alone. She was just one of many women caught in a system designed to exploit, shame, and discard. The difference is her moment of crisis left behind a story we can now point to. A warning that demands we ask, how many others were there? How many starlets, never famous enough to be remembered, simply vanished under the weight of what Cohn demanded? Rita Hayworth, perhaps the most iconic face Columbia ever produced, once called Cohn the most difficult man she'd ever worked with. And that's putting it mildly. He plucked her from obscurity, changed her name, changed her body, changed her life. She was a Latina woman turned into a fantasy figure for white American. Cohn never let her forget who made that possible. When Hayworth dared to marry Orson Welles without Cohn's approval, he retaliated not with words, but with pressure. He slashed her salary, blocked projects, undermined her career, all because she made a personal decision outside of his control. To Cohn, that was betrayal. And yet, the studio flourished, even as the abuse piled up, even as the whispers grew louder. Columbia kept turning out hits. Gilda, CoverGirl, All the King's Men. The Oscars kept coming. The profits ballooned. And the culture of complicity expanded right alongside them. Let's be honest, Cohn wasn't an anomaly. He was the rule dressed as the exception. The kind of tyrant Hollywood knew how to protect. Because he made the machine run. You didn't challenge him, you worked around him. Or you disappeared. That's what makes these stories so important to remember. Not because they're dramatic or salacious, but because they expose how an entire system can revolve around a single man's ego and survive off the silence of everyone who knows better. For years, the question of how someone like Harry Cohn could operate unchecked has haunted film historians. But the answer is always the same, because he understood the unspoken rules. If you make money, you're valuable. If you win awards, you're respected. And if you control enough contracts, you're untouchable. Until, of course, you touch the wrong nerve. And in Cohn's case, that nerve came in the form of a romance he deemed unacceptable. A relationship that crossed not just personal boundaries, but racial ones. A pairing that threatened his control in the most visceral way possible. Because when Kim Novak fell in love with Sammy Davis Jr., Cohn didn't just see a scandal. He saw an insubordination that had to be destroyed by any means necessary. What happened next wasn't a warning. It was a threat, delivered with mob precision and moral cowardice. A warning so brutal, it nearly cost a man his life. By the late 1950s, Harry Cohn had outlasted many of his rivals. He had clawed his way from poverty row to the pinnacle of the studio system, and in the process, built Columbia Pictures into a cultural machine. But the higher the tower rises, the more fragile it becomes. And for a man like Cohn spent his life molding stars, rewriting personal histories, and policing every inch of his empire, the greatest threat wasn't financial loss. It wasn't competition. It was the possibility that someone he couldn't fully control might start making decisions of their own. That person was Kim Novak. Novak was the ideal product of Cohn's vision. Discovered young, shaped an image, and positioned as Columbia's next great leading lady. He made her dye her hair, drop weight, change her name, and lean into a fantasy that was never hers to begin with. She resisted some changes like his suggestion to rename her Kit Marlowe, but overall, she played along. Because in Hollywood, compliance is often disguised as opportunity. And then, she did something unforgivable. She fell in love. The man was Sammy Davis Jr., a magnetic, brilliant, barrier-breaking entertainer who had already defied odds by making a name for himself as a black artist in segregated America. He had one eye, limitless charm, and a boldness that didn't always sit well with the white establishment, especially not the kind of establishment that ran on image. In the eyes of Harry Cohn, this relationship wasn't just a scandal waiting to happen, it was a direct assault on everything he had invested in. To him, Kim Novak wasn't a woman. She was a symbol, a brand, a product carefully manufactured to appeal to white audiences across Middle America. Her being romantically linked to a black man threatened to rupture that illusion, not just socially but commercially. Cohn's fury wasn't private. When rumors surfaced in 1957 that Novak and Davis were secretly engaged, something inside him snapped. And then, according to multiple credible sources, she made a phone call. Not to lawyers, not to publicists, but to his friends in the mob. What happened next wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't allegorical. It was the kind of cold, bone-deep threat that comes from people who don't blink when they make it. The message, delivered by notorious gangster Mickey Cohen to Sammy Davis Jr. S. father, was blunt. If Davis didn't end things with Novak immediately, the consequences would be permanent. They didn't just threaten his career. They threatened his body. They said they would break both his legs, take out his remaining eye, bury him. And this wasn't a bluff. Davis had already lost one eye in a car crash years earlier. The implication was clear. The next time, he wouldn't be lucky enough to walk away. It's hard to overstate how horrifying that moment must have been. Sammy Davis Jr., one of the most beloved entertainers in the country, was now being hunted not by a racist mob on the streets, but by a Hollywood executive protecting an investment. That's the part people miss. This wasn't just about bigotry. It was about ownership. About Cohn's belief that he had the right to intervene in someone else's love life, because that love didn't fit his business model. And it worked. Davis, terrified and cornered, agreed to a rushed marriage with a black showgirl named Lorraine White. It was a sham, a desperate performance. He reportedly paid her to go through with it. They married in a small ceremony in January 1958, with a handful of witnesses and even fewer smiles. That night, Davis drank himself into oblivion. One friend later recalled that he tried to strangle his new bride in a drunken spiral of rage and heartbreak. He kept saying, "Why won't they let me live my life?" The friend remembered. Meanwhile, Kim Novak was shielded from the ugliest details. Cohn kept her in the dark about just how far he had gone. But the relationship was effectively dead. And Harry Cohn? He had gotten what he wanted, Novak single, Davis silenced, and his studio's golden image preserved. But here's the thing about power pushed to its limit. It doesn't make you stronger. It makes you brittle. Because just days after the scandal exploded behind closed doors, Cohn suffered a heart attack on a flight. It was the first of several. His doctors warned him to slow down. He didn't listen. He never did. He returned to work, doubled down on his grip over Colombia, and tried to pretend the stress wasn't cracking his foundation. But those around him saw it. The Novak Davis situation had shaken something loose. Not just in his heart, but in his armor. For the first time, Harry Cohn wasn't untouchable. He was vulnerable. And maybe that's the real legacy of this chapter. That a man who could manipulate studios, intimidate stars, and silence entire narratives had to call in criminals just to stop a woman from loving a man. That's not strength. That's terror disguised as control. What's most haunting is not that it happened, but that it remained a whisper for so long, buried beneath red carpet glamour and old studio myths. The Novak Davis affair was known in certain circles. People talked about it in half-truths, in coded language, in private recollections decades after the fact. But for years, there was no formal reckoning, no front-page scandal, no accountability. Because in the world Harry Cohn built, secrets were power, and fear was policy. Today, we look back on his film Son, the glossy posters, and the perfectly lit close-ups, and we marvel at the artistry. But behind every frame was a system willing to crush anything that didn't serve the illusion. And this was the price of that illusion: love broken by violence, identity rewritten by branding. And one of America's greatest entertainers nearly blended a game cause someone decided he didn't fit the story being sold. This is what happens when a studio doesn't just make fiction. It starts living by it. When someone like Harry Cohn pushes boundaries, it's easy to blame it on the man, on his upbringing, on his temper, on his hunger for control. But what's harder and far more revealing just to ask what made that control possible? Who benefited from it? Who kept it quiet? Because while Cohn orchestrated, bullied, and threatened his way through Columbia Pictures, he wasn't acting in a vacuum. He was protected by a system, by a code, by a town that preferred order over justice and profitability over principle. It's tempting to view the Novak Davis scandal as an isolated moment of moral collapse. But in truth, it was the symptom of a deeper rot, one that stretched across every studio lot in Los Angeles. The idea that someone like Cohn could summon mob threats to police the personal lives of his stars wasn't shocking to insiders. It was par for the course. Hollywood in the studio era ran on unspoken rules. Directors didn't challenge moguls. Writers didn't question edits. Actors didn't refuse contracts. And nobody talked about what really went on behind closed doors. This silence wasn't neutral. It was strategic, and it allowed men like Harry Cohn to frame their behavior not as cruelty, but as necessity. He wasn't abusive, he was efficient. He wasn't controlling, was focused. He wasn't violating women, was shaping stars. That's the mythology they built around him. That he was a hard man in a hard business. That you couldn't make great films without stepping on a few toes. And the lie worked. People repeated it for decades. Even those who despised him would grudgingly add, "But you have to admit, he got results." That phrase, the ultimate excuse. As if box office receipts and Oscar wins could sanitize everything beneath the surface. That's how complicity operates. Not through enthusiastic approval, but through resigned acceptance. Through nervous jokes at parties. Through side glances in hallways. Through the phrase, "That's just how Harry is." It's worth noting how many people in power chose to intervene only when things got loud. When lawsuits threatened headlines. When a star wanted out. When reputations, not lives, were at stake. Even Louis B. Mayer, himself no stranger to autocratic leadership, once stepped in to mediate a conflict between Cohn and director King Vidor. Not because he was shocked by Cohn's abuse, but because he wanted to keep things quiet, tidy, off the front page. This wasn't justice. It was containment. And what about the press? The gossip columns, the trade magazines, The fan weeklies? They knew. Everyone knew. But access was currency. And Columbia's doors didn't open to those who poked too hard. There were whispers. The occasional blind item. Hints of the iron hand behind Columbia's success. But no exposés. No reckoning. Not while Cohn was alive. Even in death. The industry couldn't quite decide how to talk about him. When Harry Cohn died in 1958, the funeral was one of the largest Hollywood had ever seen. 2,000 people gathered. Some wept. Some smiled quietly. Some, as comedian Red Skelton famously quipped, just wanted to be sure it was true. It's a moment that captures the contradictions perfectly. Public grief. Private relief. A man mourned not for who he was, but for what he represented, an era of absolute power. Unshaken by scandal. Unpunished by conscience. The tributes were polite. Sanitized. They praised his vitality. His passion for film. His uncompromising standards. Few mentioned the trail of broken contracts, broken trust, and broken spirits he left behind. Because even after all he had done, Cohn's legacy was still being curated. Even in death, the narrative had to be managed. Why? Because deep down, the industry feared what it might see if it looked too closely. Not just at Harry Cohn, but at itself. He wasn't an outlier. He was a reflection of a business model built on hierarchies, of an artistic culture that demanded obedience before authenticity, of a workforce conditioned to see abuse as a stepping stone. The saddest part? Many of the people who endured him, who suffered under his reign, also made their best work in that same period. That's the paradox Cohn forced upon them. You could be successful if you were willing to be silent. And so the myth of the necessary monster was born. The idea that certain men were just too good at what they did to be held accountable. That their cruelty was a form of brilliance. That without them, the studio would collapse. It's a myth we still wrestle with today. The names have changed. The headlines are louder. But the dynamic remains hauntingly familiar. Power excused by success. Harm justified by legacy. Systems preserved by silence. And that's why Harry Cohn's story still matters. Not because he was uniquely evil, but because he was perfectly enabled. He exposed the worst instincts of a system designed to reward control and punish resistance. And for decades, that system worked exactly as intended. Until it didn't. When the curtain finally fell on Harry Cohn's life, it didn't drop with a scandal or a trial or a public reckoning. It ended, almost poetically, with a heart attack in a luxury Arizona hotel in early 1958, just weeks after orchestrating one of the most vicious behind-the-scenes campaigns in Hollywood history. He died en route to the hospital, slumped in the back of an ambulance. His empire intact and his myth already taking shape. The tributes that followed were awkward. Eulogies strained to find balance. Obituaries praised his business acumen, his eye for talent, his relentless drive. But beneath every line was a shadow, the unspoken truth that this man, who had made Columbia Pictures a pillar of American cinema, had also made it a fortress of fear. And yet, nearly everyone in the business came to his funeral. 2,000 attendees packed the Columbia soundstage that had been converted into a memorial, a space once used to shoot scenes of romance, conflict, and triumph. Now housed the body of the man who had pulled the strings behind them all. Comedian Red Skelton, never one to miss a punchline, delivered the most honest line of the day. Harry always said, "Give the public what they want, and they'll come out for it." And here we are. That moment wasn't just comic relief. It was a eulogy in disguise. A biting summary of a man whose death was met with both solemnity and satisfaction. But perhaps the more disturbing truth is this: even in death, Harry Cohn never really disappeared. Because the structures he thrived in, the mechanisms of control, the glamorized image of the ruthless mogul, The equation of power with genius never died with him. They simply evolved. Look at how Cohn is remembered today. Film buffs recall him as the meanest man in Hollywood. Biographers call him a tyrant with taste. Historians credit him with shaping mid-century cinema. His name sits beside legendary titles and Oscar-winning films. Rarely do people say, he surveilled women. He threatened lives. He treated human beings as assets. Why? Because legacy is a game of selective memory. And in Hollywood, that memory is often polished by box office numbers and golden statues. It's true that Harry Cohn left behind great films. It's true that he discovered or elevated names like Rita Hayworth, Jack Lemmon, Kim Novak, and Frank Capra. And it's true that Columbia Pictures went from poverty row to prestige thanks in large part to his force of will. But it's also true that those achievements were built on a foundation of intimidation, manipulation, and silence. The contradiction is hard to stomach. On one hand, we owe him for pushing certain films into existence. On the other, we must ask, at what cost? How many voices were never heard because of his control? How many women were erased before they ever got a chance? How many actors, writers, and directors had their lives redirected because they refused to bow? It raises a deeper question, one not just about Cohn, but about the culture that made him possible. Should we separate the art from the artist? Can we? Or does doing so risk romanticizing abuse as brilliance? Some would argue that great art has always come from difficult people, that you can't create without conflict, that the very same traits that made Cohn a terror in the boardroom gave him the instincts to greenlight classics. But maybe that's a convenient narrative, one that protects those in power more than it protects the truth. Because what if the art could have been just as great, maybe greater, if the industry didn't tolerate cruelty as the price of genius? What if Jean Arthur had stayed? What if Sammy Davis Jr. hadn't been threatened into a sham marriage? What if actresses didn't have to choose between silence and survival? We'll never know. And that's the point. The Harry Cohn story is not just about a man. It's about an ecosystem. One that allowed abuse to be reframed as discipline, and violence to be swept aside as pragmatism. It's also a story about how easily we forget, how quickly we let legacies outshine the damage they leave behind, how art becomes armor for the powerful, shielding them from the full weight of accountability. But maybe that's starting to change. In recent years, Hollywood has been forced to confront its past and, in some cases, its present. Names like Weinstein, Cosby, and others have sparked a broader reckoning with power dynamics that once seemed untouchable. And in that context, Harry Cohn feels less like ancient history and more like a prototype. He wasn't the last. He was one of the first. A pioneer not just in film, but in the darker arts of reputation control and narrative manipulation. And maybe that's the true takeaway here, that systems don't change until their myths are broken. Harry Cohn sold the world a version of himself, a mogul, a mastermind, a maker of stars. And for decades, people bought it. They excused the terror. They laughed off the cruelty. They called him difficult instead of dangerous. Because that's how power protects itself. Through language. Through legacy. But we have the ability and the responsibility to tell these stories differently now. To resist the urge to canonize complicated men without interrogating the harm they caused. To remember that the bright lights of Hollywood have always cast long shadows. In the end, maybe Harry Cohn did get his wish. He built Columbia Pictures. He made history. He drew a crowd at his funeral. And he left behind a myth. But myths are meant to be questioned, especially when they were paid for in silence, suffering, and fear. The question isn't whether Harry Cohn was a genius or a monster. The real question is, why did it take us so long to admit he could be both? And what does that say not about him but about us? So maybe the story of Harry Cohn isn't just a relic of old Hollywood. Maybe it's a mirror held up to the systems we still navigate today, where power often hides behind legacy, and silence is rewarded more than truth. Maybe the real lesson isn't whether we should celebrate the films he made or condemn the man he was. Maybe the real question is, how many more Harry Cohns have we allowed to thrive in the spaces where we once applauded, looked away, or told ourselves it was the cost of doing great work? And if we're still asking that question today, how far have we really come? Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a truth that was meant to stay buried. See you next time.